This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for the Intentionality Gurus. And according to Candace, we're starting a new series. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't go back and listen to the last series because I certainly learned a lot about myself. But this new series is called Grief Recovery Method. And, you know, we've all been doing a lot of grieving this past year. So I think this is going to help some of us, maybe me.
Yeah, and there's a lot of lessons from it. So I'm a certified advanced grief recovery method specialist. And what that means is I went through some formal training about how to recover from grief. And the advanced part is now I'm trained to do it online. Prior to that, it was in-person programs. But going back to get the online training, re-immersed me in the original training. And I recognized that there's so much grieving going on, and there's so many misconceptions about grief that it would be appropriate to talk about it on this podcast. And the reason is because we're all, the intentionality gurus, the guru part is, to reveal the darkness of the unknown, the hidden iceberg of things that drive a lot of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And this is just somewhere on that spectrum.
Okay.
Okay. So when I say the word grief, or you saw the name grief in the title, what was your first instinct or physical reaction?
Well, my first reaction was, grieving the loss of somebody who had passed away. Yet over this past week, I've been realizing that we grieve for a lot of other reasons. Uh, we grieve when we don't get a promotion at work. We grieve over, losing something. It doesn't have to be someone, it can be, an object. And it made me realize that a lot of us have been sort of like holding off grief this past year because we don't know what's happening day to day.
We've been living with a lot of uncertainty, insecurity,
Right.
some of it financial, some of it emotional, some of it, possibly with, where people live, health wise, and so on. And so it is for any kind of loss, but we often think of it in terms of a death, a loss of a relationship. And the dictionary says it's deep sorrow, especially that's caused by someone's death. But it could be that estrangement of a relationship, either because someone else chose to be the stranger, or, we are pulling away ourselves.
Right.
It could be, as death of a pet, death of, a friend. It could be basically losing a job or having a job, getting married. Even positive things can cause grief.
Sure.
And the grief recovery method arises, this handbook in particular came from John James, who lost a child, a 3-day-old child in the late 70s. And he owned a business, and he was really struggling with his grief, and he couldn't seem to find any kind of satisfaction to help him deal with it. And he went to the library looking for books on grief. This is all pre-internet, and very little there. And I think somebody has described it that he came across the stages of dying, the Dr. Kubler-Ross, and a lot of people mistake that book and the stages of dying with the stages of grief. And so what John James did is he dug in, and he started really analyzing his own grief and other people and so on. And he finally came up with this method that didn't undo the loss, obviously, but it disengaged some of the gripping pain and the paralyzing part, the thing that really immobilizes us. And he had so much success with it that others noticed it and they asked him, if, or people referred to him, others who were dealing with loss, and then he continued on and it just kept growing from there. And then eventually he realized he couldn't support all of these people in their grief journey. So he ended up writing a book, and the book is the Grief Recovery Handbook. Okay.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about that over the next few weeks and next few podcasts. And the reason is because the methods are not just for grieving situations. When I did this re-immersion in the training, to be able to do the online form of sharing it, the method, I recognized, this lesson that we have to learn is useful in these other settings. Because if we're dealing with those hidden thoughts, feelings, and emotions and behaviors, that's they're all on the same spectrum, as I said. So that's it. So that's what we're going to talk about.
Okay. I love it.
Great.
Just to preface as we go forward, um, I realized this past week, and I know you don't get onto Facebook very often, so you probably didn't see it. But I kept posting about that many of us are going through anxiety and depression right now. Um, we sort of got through 2020 believing that New Year's Eve 2021, everything was going to change.
Had to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. And not that it's bad now. I mean, it's much better now than it was a year ago. But at the same time, I think it's come to a head for many of us that, you know, the things that we think we gave up to get to where we are now, and how much longer do we have to give those things up? And it really got me to thinking, am I the only one who's feeling overwhelmed right now? Am I the only one who really wants to sit down and just have a good cry, but it's not happening? And as I've been posting it on Facebook, I've been hearing from others, and so many others, and people I don't even know, that they're going through this exact same thing. We're in the second quarter of the year, and yes, things are looking better, but it's not over. And, how do we resolve it? And I think that's a grief too. In some ways, I think.
Yeah, of sense of security and well-being. Definitely.
Exactly.
So that's the point, to be able to recognize that the grief lives in those experiences. And the story you were telling me about a relative earlier, that is a form of estrangement, not that you want it, not that that person wants it, but the forces that be, whatever the circumstances that be, are setting it up so that it's not easy to have a smooth, interactive relationship with this person you had before. So the John James, and then later Russell, I never remember Russell's last name, sorry, Russell Friedman came later, and so they're co-authors of the book. And now in the new version of the book, the daughter of Michael Landon, who is a psychologist and did studies on children who grieve, have collaborated on other types of things, like the helping children with loss, because they grieve differently. They don't know how to identify their emotions as easily as adults can. Not that all adults can. So the Grief Recovery Institute came up with a definition of grief, which is, I think, pretty powerful. And it is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior.
Okay.
You want me to say it again?
Yeah, you can say it again.
Okay. The conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior.
Okay.
So the first thing I notice is they don't mention death.
Right.
Okay. They also say that grief is a normal and natural response. And I would add that for most of us, it's unavoidable.
Okay.
And in my day job profession as an attorney, we deal with difficult situations. Just in my subset, we do estate planning. So we're always talking about death and dying and those kinds of things. I imagine criminal defense attorneys are thinking about their clients are thinking about loss of autonomy and freedom of where they're going to be and so on. Domestic relations, there's a lot of issues there in terms of loss of custody, visitation, or just the loss of the relationship and so on. So just having that definition, knowing that it's a mix of feelings, it isn't all bad, it isn't all good, it's a mix, which can be confusing and disturbing for some people. So if somebody had a long illness where they suffered a lot and they died, then sometimes we can be very sad that the person died, but we can almost feel a sense of relief for them that they're no longer suffering. Right. And so that's where some of the conflict can come in. So any particular thoughts around that?
Well, I really want people to know we do not plan these shows. And we did not discuss this, and this just came up for me this morning. So on Saturdays and Sundays, I work as an IT sales assistant trainer, and I've been at one store for about 4 years now. And we got the report of how our stores are doing, and my store has never been at the bottom, and it's at the bottom of the list. And I mean, I was sad, really sad for my store. It's like, oh my gosh, what can I do to help them? Well, after getting to work, my manager called me, and the first thing he said was, this has nothing to do with you. I want you to understand that. You've had no control over um, some of the changes in this store. He said, but I want you to know that we are moving you to another store um, where we know you can't, you'll continue to be successful because that store is in that pattern. And I felt, I guess, what we could call grief, that I'm leaving behind a group of people that I've worked very hard with
Yes.
for the last 4 years. And um, a lot of mixed emotions. Um, and tomorrow's my last day with them. And then to be told this at the beginning of my shift today, it was like, you know, I don't know how to react. On one hand, it's a great opportunity, and I don't have a choice. It's either do it or don't take the job. Um, but I wouldn't have thought it as grief this morning, but now that's exactly what I'm feeling.
So what occurs to you by recognizing it as grief?
Um, well, number one, we go through this a lot in our life. There's always something that is happening around us, and maybe we don't give it the name of grief. But for me, what I felt when I was told, um, I felt like I got hit in the gut. I mean, I wanted to say, no, 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 let me resurrect this again. Let's take out the paddles and uh, jolt this store back to life. And yet, on the other hand, it was almost a relief because I've seen the handwriting on the wall. And so now I'm trying to, you know, muddle my way through this, to accept the sadness, but know that there's something better on the other side.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And imagine how difficult that would be if it were a death you were dealing with, that, to be able to say, well, there's, a rainbow on the other side, because we aren't allowed to say that to ourselves. I mean, it would be difficult, impossible to say that if it was a dear loved one,
Right.
or even a dear pet,
Right.
and so on. So that's part of the grief recovery method, is to kind of pull apart those components so that we can see how we're ill prepared and socialized to deal with grief. I mean, we have cultural, social, religious, who knows what forces that contribute to our ideas of grief. And I remember seeing a movie, and then within the movie, they had some real live documentary type clips of women who were grieving the death of some family members, and it was shrieking and throwing their bodies over the dead person's body, and loud screaming and so on. And that doesn't happen necessarily in our country, but that was clearly a cultural norm in somebody else's country. All right. And so the idea is that how we observe other people grieve, and the things that are said to us help color how we grieve. And then that is like the concentric circles, a pebble in a still lake, with the concentric circles that come out from that can impact so many other things, other people, our jobs, certainly our well-being, our happiness, and so on.
Absolutely.
So I wasn't expecting you to be a guinea pig for all of this, but this may be the opportune time, and I would not be so glib if it were a death. And the point is that all grief is 100% grief, and we should never compare our grief with somebody else's grief, because it's our grief. But the idea is that this would be a perfect opportunity to kind of go through some of the process to be able to see how universal the approach is to lots of different scenarios. It's not the same thing as going through the program, because the program is designed to be, it's been studied and tested. And let me just, say this really explicitly. So the Grief Recovery Method Group Program has been peer reviewed by entities that vet these kinds of things. And so it has the mark of approval with case studies and so on through universities. And it's the only grief recovery method out there that does
Okay.
have that. Okay. Now, the other programs, the online programs, are based on that program, and they will be going through their own vetting process for the same peer review, credentialing and so on, to show that they are, scientifically effective.
Okay.
So the beauty of it is we can learn from these lessons that the grief recovery has put together, and then we can cope a little better with some of these things. If just recognizing that alone, could be a major fork in the road. Oh, I'm dealing with grief. I need to be a little extra compassionate with myself.
Right.
And some of the other things that studies show is that there's a spike in accidents after a loved one has passed away. That the family, somebody in the family often has a car accident, or they have some other illnesses and so on. And not that they're being hypochondriacs, it's part of that ripple effect. So it can be really important in many ways. And so the idea with how we are groomed to think about grief, can you think of situations, what do you call them? Not burials, but funerals that you've gone to, and the things that people have said to you regarding a family member?
Well, one in particular, I wasn't at the funeral, but the story has been told over and over again. Um, I had um, I had an aunt. She was married to my mother's brother, and she had a brother who ended up getting lung cancer. He was never smoked in his life. He wasn't a drinker, none of these things. Okay. So, such an unexpected condition for him. And when he passed away, the story goes that at his funeral, um, his his sister like jumped on top of the casket and was crying her eyes out. This can't be happening. Take me, whatever. And the story is still shared, even though many of the players who were there have all passed themselves. And I remember hearing this as a young kid, and I remember asking my parents, is that what you're supposed to do? Is that how I show somebody that I love them? And my parents said to me, we can't tell you it's something that you should do. Um, Most people don't do that. But someday you may face, the loss of somebody, and it might, propel you to do that.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
if that's what's important to you, then you do it. And so that as a young kid, I heard it and was like, okay, they're not saying she did anything terrible. But as I got older and the story continued to go around, it was like, can you believe she made such an idiot of herself? And, you know, w- she wasn't that close to him to begin with. And I've thought about it. And it's like, why, why judge that person at the time that they did it or years later?
Exactly,
If
exactly,
that,
because everybody grieves in their own way.
absolutely.
And some people become, are workaholics and they dive into their work. And from the outside, it may not show that they're having any emotions, or they've at least stuffed them inside so nobody else has to deal with them, including themselves. Or others, turn to drinking or, other activity. And there's actually a term that we'll talk about as part of the method of going through the program, that we can become aware of those things that um, we our way of dealing, stuffing our emotions in essence.
Absolutely.
So my father died when I was reasonably young. I was an adult, but a young adult. And I remember very well-meaning people who had been family friends for years, and he died of a heart attack suddenly, no known health condition that we were aware of. And people said things like, well, at least it was quick, dear. And what are some other things? He didn't suffer, and he loved you girls, meaning his daughters, and so on. And so what the Grief Recovery Institute talks about there is, these are things that are intellectually true. All right. But it isn't that my brain needs to be convinced, it's that my heart needs to be convinced. All right. So it's not a broken head problem, it's a broken heart problem. And I just love that idea, because it is so easy for us to intellectualize our feelings. And in fact, I've said many times that I coach attorneys, and the irony with attorneys is, you ask them a question and first, they're trying to give the right answer, like they're like having a spot quiz. But the other is when you say, well, how did that feel? Where do you feel it in your body? They say things like, well, I would feel it, I think, in my head. If I'm asking you, where do you actually feel it? And it's really hard for them to get in, because, we probably go into law because we aren't comfortable with our feelings. That's a way to stuff it. And then we are taught to intellectualize, to analyze, and we're not taught to, wear our hearts on our sleeve. I mean, we can be very impassioned and be advocates for causes, but when it comes to our professional training and so on, we can't let that get in the way.
Sure.
So any phrases like that you can recall?
Um, well, specifically, when my dad passed away, um, you know, every, so I didn't know the whole story of my father's heart issues his whole life. Um, but I had learned probably as a young adult, um, that my father he got the Spanish flu right after he was born. My father was born in 1917. Um, both he and his mother both got the Spanish flu. She recovered fairly quickly. They did not expect my father to live, but he did, obviously. And from that, it scarred his heart. And nobody really knew why my father every once in a while would complain of chest pains. And as a young adult, they didn't, they assumed it couldn't be his heart, you know. But my father had angina pain. They finally told us from the age of like 10 or 11 up.
Mm,
And um, my father sort of like learned to live with it and how to handle it. And once he got older and went on medications, and so we all looked at my dad as being invincible because he'd have angina pain that would lead to a heart attack, and then we'd be told he's not going to make it, and he would. And now, my dad passes away, and everybody just kept saying to us things like, well, your dad's no longer in pain anymore. That should make you feel good.
right,
But
exactly.
it's like, well, yeah, that makes me feel good that he's not
In
in pain.
my brain, I can understand that, but in my heart, it doesn't make the pain go away.
Exactly. And especially because the last 2 months of my dad's life, my mother kept all of us away from my dad. Uh, she had hospice at the home, and she just wanted the time for him. Now, he talked to us every night on the phone. In fact, I talked to him the night before he died. Um, and he was even making those same sort of comments to me. I've had a good life. I've loved you. Um, when my end comes, I'm not going to be in pain anymore. And I remember saying to him, you may not be in pain anymore, but I'll be in pain. And then I felt guilty for saying that. Uh, I've gotten over the guilt, but uh, yeah,
Well, and it's not just at the time of death. When my husband died, I struggled. It took me a long time. I was in a deep, deep pit, and I never lost a day from work. I'm self-employed. I couldn't afford it. And, I'm always would, dive into work as my way of dealing with unhappy situations. And it was maybe about a year later, I was at an event. It's an annual event. And so I had seen a friend at the event closest to when the year my husband died. And then a year later, I saw this person, and I mentioned to him at the first one, apparently, that my husband had died. And I was really teary then. But then he saw me the following year, and I was still teary. And he goes, how are you doing? And so on. And I said, oh, so and so, it's really been rough. My husband died. For me, it was just as if it had been like a few months,
sure.
right, for me emotionally. And he says, you told me that last year. Like, okay, I should be
Wow.
over it. And, all right. So then what happened for me, the visual for me was like the garage door came down, like, slammed to the ground shut. It's like, okay, stuff those emotions. I'm not going to make that mistake again. And then I had another episode with an agency person, and they escort you out of the building after you have a hearing. And we were talking, and she was saying something to me. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm I have to write this down. I'm having difficulty with memory. My husband died, and I'm still struggling with that from time to time. And she said, well, just how long has it been? Okay, again, all right. I didn't get into all the particulars, but
Right.
so the point of it is these are all kinds of messages about what's allowed and what's not allowed, when it should be what our hearts and are saying to us. All right, not everybody else. We're not grieving by committee, in other words,
Right.
right?
Well, and I have to say that when my mother passed away, um, obviously I had been living with her for 2.5 months. We knew from the day that I moved in that it was inevitable and it was going to come sooner than later. Um, And I remember people months afterwards saying to me, "When are you going to stop grieving?" And I we had a terrible hospice experience up in Michigan. And so I turned to the hospice of the Western Reserve because I needed to talk to somebody. And the first thing they said to me was, there is no time limit on grief. And you probably will grieve the rest of your life. It's not going to show up 24/7, but you'll hear a song, you'll see a picture, you'll hear a remark, um, you'll share comments, and it's going to hit you. And that's okay. That's normal. Especially when you care about someone or something very, very much. And it was just that information that made me realize, you know what? Don't question anybody, including yourself. you know, when is it time to stop grieving?
Yeah, and so the idea behind the grief recovery method is that it's the pain will be there. It won't always be as acute and deep at all times, as you say, but the suffering, the really deep suffering part will lessen. All right, and just by going through the method. And again, there's scientific evidence to show that this is effective. So that's basically the setup for the remaining parts that we're going to learn. So what I would like you and me and others who are listening to do is just to go through, the next couple of weeks and make a list of all the things that you're grieving. And they can be old griefs that you're still carrying forward, because some of these events can have lifelong consequences. It's like an onion. And if we haven't resolved some of prior grief, we're just, layering upon layer upon layer, um, um, pulling that forward and so on. So if we can all just make a list of those things, that interaction, the promotion mixed bag there for you, COVID issues, whatever with friends and so on, that relative that you mentioned, all of that has elements of grief. And then we can move forward in the next few podcasts, and I'll show you how to deal with some of it.
This sounds amazing. So, one question to you now, you're going to start doing these online, um, will they be one on ones? Will they be,
There is one-on-one that is I'm currently authorized to do. I'm authorized to do the Helping Children with Loss program, and the group program they haven't rolled out the certification for that just yet, because they want to be able to deliver the same quality and reliability um, in an online uh, version as they know they do in the um, in-person program. And by then, depending on our COVID numbers and so on, we can all resume doing some of the group programs. I know that some people have, with lots of, checks and balances, safe, the masks and so on, but it isn't always the same, particularly if tears do come up, the masks have to be removed and so on. So but yes, so right now I do programs one-on-one, because that's all they have rolled out for authorization, but they tell us that they will be rolling out the training for the group programs.
how interesting?
Yeah, so it doesn't sound like a happy topic. I mean, I know it sounds like Debbie Downer, but it's an unavoidable topic. And, do we want to go through life having the darkness of unknowing, the guru part? Or do we want to have some choice in our life regarding a path of suffering or a path of something else?
Absolutely. Well, I know we are getting more listeners because I keep looking at the numbers. So, those of you who are out there, um, I think what we may try to do, maybe not the next podcast, but the podcast after that, is open up this link for you to be part of the conversation. And what I'll do is I will post it out on Facebook. and say, if you want to participate, feel free to. Um, and, you know, let's help each other.
Exactly, exactly. So
Well, you
thank,
have a great day, and wear the mask, stay healthy, and we'll talk to you in 2 weeks.
sounds good. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.